Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create some Let It Snow cards. We're using the new Let It Snow line from Simon Hurley and Spellbinders. This one here is called Layered Snowflakes, and I love that the snowflakes are 3 different sizes, plus they have shadows to them. This one is called Playful Penguins, and these are absolutely adorable holiday penguins that you can decorate. I love all the different sentiments that you can create from the handwritten holiday set here. And this last one is called Frozen Flurries die, and it's a nice background die. And I really love the fact that there's a border die separate from that background. Now, of course, because we're going to use a Simon Hurley line, we might as well use his new Astro paste. I had these on pre-order from my local scrapbook store, and they came in at the perfect time. So I'm going to use them with that Playful Penguins die set, but I want to make sure to give it lots of time to dry. So I have some Simon tools here, and I'm using a piece of just hammer mill cardstock, putting a little bit of each paste on them, and then I'm going to set them aside to dry. I'm going to use that Playful Penguins die set for my last card, and I just want to make sure that I give them a lot of time to dry so that I don't have half set paste interfering with my dies. So I ended up letting them dry for 24 hours just to make sure that they were nice and dry, but it's a great way to make your own glitter paste, and you can even mix them together if you wanted to customize them. This white one here is called Frostbite. It's not really glittery. It's more just kind of a frosted look. It's got a really cool and unique look, and you can't find any glitter paper like it. I love the different colors here. There's other colors in the line. These were just my favorite ones that I chose, and I was really excited to see how they would look. Now, for my first card, I'm going to use that Frozen Flurries background die set. I'm going to use it with some Sukwing double-sided tape. This is one of my favorite double-sided tapes. It's nice and strong, and I love using it for different techniques for backgrounds. So I have a piece of hammer mill cardstock here that I'm putting this tape on, and then just using a craft knife to cut it down to size. I will be using the Simon Hurley tool that I used to put that glitter paste on, and I'm going to make sure that that tape is nice and attached to that cardstock and absolutely no bubbles. And that tool came in really handy for exactly that thing. So I'm going to use the background die here. I'm not going to use the outline die set. Once my background is done, I can custom cut it down to the size that I want it to be. Now, if you cut something large like this with a big straight edge, you'll find you have a much easier time without having that straight edge against the rollers. So if you tilt it on your die machine and then run it through, it'll run through a whole lot better. So if you're having an issue with the die set not wanting to go through, that might be your answer. So once I had that die cut, I wanted to look at the back, and any area that might be cut all the way through, I'm just going to put some of that excess tape backing on to make sure all of those pieces stay in. The ones that I taped back there, they didn't really even cut all the way through, so I didn't really need to do this, but I wanted to make sure to say that. Some die machines are a little bit tighter than others, so when you're doing this technique, sometimes you may have that die going all the way through, and what we're actually looking for here is that die cutting just through that tape backing, not necessarily all the way through. When I took that die out, I had 2 tiny little pieces that wanted to come out with it, so I put them back in to their openings because I want to do the background first and then do all the tiny little pieces. So once those 2 pieces were back in, I can take the background or the backing of the background piece off of my piece here, and I can take a scrap piece of that tape backing and use it to rest my hand on while I take a pair of tweezers and remove all the tiny little bits from the snowflakes. The snowflakes have little tiny detail pieces in them, so this technique is going to go a lot smoother if you do both the background and all those little inside pieces at the same time. I started it on screen and did the rest of it off screen because it looks really repetitive. What I'm wanting to do here is put some distress glaze on my background. So I have a little Slurpee straw here. I save these for this particular technique and other techniques with mica powder. You could just use a little spoon if you want. And I put that paste or that embossing glaze on my background. Now I tapped the excess off, and if you take a brush and brush the excess off, it's just going to brush off the tape. So here is what we're going to do. We're going to put that powder right back on, and I'm trying not to get some harsh lines here. So I don't want to have a line straight across. This is where that Slurpee straw or a scoop or a spoon comes in really handy, because you can have it a couple inches above your piece and let that embossing glaze kind of drop down so you're not going to get harsh lines. And then I'm going to take a piece of that tape backing, probably about 1 inch by 1 inch or 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches, and just use it to rub that embossing glaze into the tape, making sure it's sticking really, really well. It's also going to take off the excess that is sticking to the tape backing by static, and it's just going to make sure that it's stuck really well, and it's a good way to get the excess off. I'm doing the same thing with the next color. So the first color was Uncharted Mariner. The lighter blue is Speckled Egg, and then I'm using Lost Shadow, which is a light gray. Now, when I took the excess off the Speckled Egg, I just put it back in the container. There's a couple specks of that Uncharted Mariner in there, but having a couple specks of the dark blue isn't going to hurt it in any way. For the Lost Shadow, I took the first amount that just came right off when I was pouring it on there and put that back into the Lost Shadow. But when it came to using a piece of tape backing to rub it and get any excess off, I tossed that away because it did have some particles of the blue in there, and I'd like to keep that Lost Shadow embossing glaze as true as possible. Then I'm using my heat tool and I am melting that embossing powder. Now, one thing to note is anytime I did the rubbing with the tape backing on my background here, I used a separate or a new piece of that tape backing to make sure that my colors stayed as true as possible. I usually, when I'm doing different techniques, if I have larger pieces of tape backing, I keep them for techniques like this. So I have a bin with a little bit of a stash of them because it comes in really handy. If you don't have that, you could use a little piece of wax paper, a little piece of parchment paper. It will do exactly the same thing. Now, once I have this whole piece melted, I have this really cool looking background that is got some gloss from the embossing glaze. And I love using the embossing glaze for this because it has that transparency. So it just has a different look to it. You could do this with regular embossing powder though. It would have just a tiny little bit of a different look. Now I'm going to take the tape backing from all of those snowflakes off. And the tweezers that I'm using are not the reverse tweezers that I often use in videos. These are tweezers that you have to hold to close. So by holding them to close, I have a really good grip on those tape backing pieces, and it's a little bit easier to take them off. Once we have all of the tape backing pieces off, I'm going to use some microfine glitter, and any of that tape backing that is exposed is going to be covered with that microfine glitter. So we're going to create a really cool background with this. While you're taking that tape backing off, if you get to a point where you can't remember if you took the backing off of a piece or not, you can put the glitter on and you'll discover that way. Or you can just tap the end of the tweezers onto that area and you'll tell right away if it's sticky because it's tape backing or tape, or if it's not sticky because it's tape backing. Once I have my glitter on there, I'm using another piece of that tape backing and buffing that glitter in place. It just flattens it and makes sure that glitter has really good contact with the adhesive, and it also makes it really, really sparkly. Once I'm done that, I just took a soft brush and brushed off any excess. And then off screen, I trimmed that piece down. Now for my mat on this card, I'm using some matte silver cardstock from the Treasured Cardstock pack. I have my matte silver cardstock cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4, and I cut my snowflake backing to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. Now I want to do a Let It Snow sentiment on this card, but rather than using a separate piece of that specialty paper, because specialty papers can get a little bit expensive sometimes, I'm just using the inside part of my mat. It's going to go behind that snowflake background and you're never going to know that anything was cut out of it. This is a great way to extend your specialty papers and make them go a little bit farther. I'm going to glue that to my card base, and then I'm going to glue down my snowflake background. Now for all of my gluing, I'm using Barely Art glue. I have it in a fine line bottle. That way I can use it for really, really intricate dies, and I can also use it for large backgrounds like this. I'm also going to utilize those pieces of double-sided tape that I used on that backing in order to make sure that any piece that was cut through wasn't going to fall out. So I've got both that double-sided tape as well as that Barely Art glue gluing that piece down. I put an acrylic block on there and just set it to the side so it can dry while I am doing my sentiment here. These sentiments come out of the die really, really easy. They're really nice and fine sentiments, but they come out of the die really quite easily. And even for my next card, I'm using glitter cardstock, and then my last card, I'm using that cardstock that I did at the beginning of the video with the Astro paste, and it also cuts out of that as well. So when I was taking my sentiments out of my die, I lost the tiny little dot for the T. Now I thought maybe I could use one of the little pieces from the snowflakes, but it looked a little odd. So I ended up taking one of the scraps that I had cut off when I was trimming down the words and die cutting them off screen just to get that dot back and then replace it. Looks so much better with that dot that's supposed to be there because it's really quite tiny. In the end, I found it sitting on top of a piece of cardstock off screen, so it must have jumped somewhere while I was taking them out of the dies, but it looks totally fine now. So I have this Let It Snow on the center of my card, and I wanted to add just a tiny little bit more dimension, a little bit more texture to my background. So I have another piece of that brushed silver cardstock that I used the same die on, the same Frozen Flurries background die, and I die cut it. I'm using some of those snowflakes here, and I'm going to layer them on top of my background. Now you don't have to do this. You could leave your background as is with just that embossing glaze and the glitter. This just adds a little bit of an extra touch to it. I don't use all of the snowflakes that come out of here. I use maybe half of them. And I'm laying them on here, and once I have them laid on there, I can start using my Barely Art glue and glue them down and then put that acrylic block on there to hold everything in place while it dries. Now the one thing to note while it dries, we're gluing this onto embossing glaze, so it's a non-porous surface, so you're going to want to let it dry for a little bit longer than you would necessarily dry just cardstock to cardstock. So keep that in mind. And you'll notice as I am working on this, I start putting it on the top pieces that have that glue on them just to hold them nice and flat while they are drying and while I am gluing some of the lower pieces on there. Now I started gluing the snowflakes and wanted to make sure that I had my sentiments put where I want them to go so that I didn't move or knock things out of place. So I glued those down. Now I love that these sentiments have a shadow to them. It makes them so easy for gluing down. If you wanted, you could glue them down without having a shadow, but for a background like this that's fairly busy, it's just an extra way for that sentiment to get a little bit more noticed by having that shadow behind it. Now here I'm using my reverse tweezers to hold that snowflake while I'm putting the glue on it. That way my fingers don't get in the way with the glue. I also don't get glue all over myself. If you wanted, you could just use your fingers to hold that die cut. But for smaller things like this, I do find it really helpful to have a pair of reverse tweezers to hold them. Now, some of the larger snowflakes I did cut in half and have them going a little bit off of the background. I just think it looks better when you have things going off the background. It looks a little bit more natural. So I did a couple like that, a couple or one on each side basically. So there's one going down the left side, one going down the right or off the right side, one going off the top and one going off the bottom. You don't necessarily have to do this again. It's personal preference. I just really like the way it looks. So I like doing it. And I typically will do kind of an odd number or one on each side. Now for on screen here, I just used some of the larger snowflakes. Off screen, I took some of the smaller snow bursts or star bursts that are in that background and just added them as well, just for a little bit of extra texture. To finish off some of the larger snowflakes, I took some of these Crystal Mix gems and put them on the center of the snowflakes. And I only did this for the silver snowflakes. I didn't do any of these for the glitter or the background snowflakes at all. To put these down, I find it easiest to take a die pick and kind of pierce into the adhesive on the back of it and place it where I want it to go and then use my finger to press it into place. This just adds a little bit of extra sparkle to the center of those snowflakes, and I really like the way they look. I also did some of the tiny gems to the little tiny starburst as well. I didn't do it all to all of them, but I just did it to a few of them. Now for my second card, I'm going to use the Layered Snowflakes die set. I have a bunch of the different finishes from the Treasured Silver cardstock that I'm using to die cut the snowflakes with, and I'm also using that sentiment with the silver paper from the Treasured glitter or Treasured Silver cardstock packages. So here is that silver glitter paper, and you can see that I die cut the warm wishes out of it. Now when I'm taking that die cut out of there, first of all, when I'm die cutting out of glitter paper, I like to have the blade side of the die up and put it through my machine back and forth once or twice. Then I look at the die, and you can see from the back right away if it's cut all the way through, and I could see with just going back and forth that it was cut all the way through. Then when I'm taking it out of the cardstock, I just kind of wiggle it a little bit. Using glitter cardstock, sometimes it's a thicker thing to go through, so sometimes it doesn't really want to come out. It kind of wants to grab itself. So by kind of wiggling it back and forth a little bit, you're just being a little bit more gentle when you're taking it out. And then I use a die pick to take the inner parts of some of the letters out, like the E and the S or whatever. So you can see that it comes out really nicely, and it die cut really quite nicely. I'm gluing it onto the shadow, and I die cut the shadow out of vellum for this, just to give it a little bit of help it stand out on the background. Now for my background, I'm using some Cloud9 matte blending inks. I am using the Garden Sage and the Anthracite. Anthracite looks on the cover of the pad like it's black, but when I swatched it, it has a really dark green look to it, and I thought it would look gorgeous with this Garden Sage color. Now I'm doing a little bit of ink blending here, and I am definitely not making it look perfect. I'm making it look really blotchy. I want that look for this background. I'm also going to flick it with water because it's water reactive. This ink is very similar to oxide inks in that it is a dye and pigment blend, and it's water reactive. It's just got different colors to it, and I really love these two color tones here. So I'm using some ink blending brushes to do this, and I'm doing it on my Altenew sticky mat. It holds that cardstock in place really well. And once I am done putting as much ink as I want to on here, I can use some water and flick it, and you can see immediately I get an immediate reaction with that. So I'm just using my distress sprayer, flicking that into my hand, and then flicking it onto the cardstock, and immediately I get the water reactive property to this. So I'm going to let that dry for a few moments. I want to add just a little bit of shimmer to this background. So I'm going to take a Cloud9 interference pad and add a little bit of spark or speckle splatter. Now I want to clean my mat off first because I also want to do a little bit of ink blending with that pad, and I don't want to contaminate my pads by still having some of the matte blending ink on there. Now I like the water reactive properties here, but for the background that I was going for, it was there was still a little bit too much contrast. So I took that Garden Sage one, did some light ink blending just to tone it down just a touch. So I'm using the Summer Garden interference pad. This one looks green on light cardstock and has blue interference on black cardstock. Because we're not working on black cardstock, we're working on just kind of a mid-tone. We're going to see that blue interference, but the green dye properties are going to go well with the matte blending ink that we're using here. I'm just using a splatter brush to do that splatter. I put a little bit of water on there, and we get just a really nice fine splatter. It just thins that ink out a little bit and gives us a really nice fine splatter. Once that has dried, I'm using a detailed ink blending brush to start my ink blending with this, and I'm just doing it around the edges. I didn't like the look of this with the detailed ink blending brush, so I'm just using a regular one and doing some ink blending around that. It's a little bit more of a subtle look, and I like the look of that a lot better. So what this is going to do is just add that interference to the edges. When you tilt this in the light, you're going to see that blue shimmer from the interference from the mica. And it looks really cool on that background and blends beautifully with that shimmer or with the splatter that is inside there. So I cleaned off my mat and set that to the side, and now we're ready to start assembling our card. So one of my snowflakes is going to be matte silver. So I die cut it out of the same mat that I'm putting behind my ink blended piece. There's no reason to use a separate piece because you're never going to see that something was die cut out of here anyways. So I have that silver piece cut down to 4 inches by 5 1/4. My ink blended piece here is cut to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. And then I can glue down my snowflakes. So I used 3 of the different silvers from that silver treasured cardstock here. I'm using silver glitter, mirror silver, and then matte silver. Now I glued down that snowflake forgetting that I had die cut a vellum shadow to it. So in a moment, you'll see me lift that up and glue it onto the shadow. It wasn't until I glued my sentiment down that I realized what I had done, but I have my shadow to the side. So it was easy enough to grab, lift it off of my card, and then put it onto that vellum. It hadn't had enough time for that glue to really set, so it was really easy to just lift it off there. Gluing that Warm Wishes sentiment to the bottom, I just want to make sure that I have some nice spacing between the sentiment and my snowflake here. And when I put my glue on that vellum back of the snowflake, I do make sure that I'm putting it behind my glitter die cut. I don't want to see that glue. Even with vellum adhesives, you still see it, and I don't like being able to see it. So I usually find ways to hide that glue. And by putting it behind the die cut, it makes it really easy to hide that. So on top of that vellum piece, I'm putting down the glossy or the mirror silver snowflake die cut. I'm getting progressively smaller. I'm working from the largest snowflake to the smallest snowflake, and the smallest one is the matte silver. That matte silver is going to blend perfectly with the matte around my ink blended piece, and the silver glitter is going to blend perfectly with the silver glitter cardstock that I used for my sentiment at the bottom. Now to finish this one off again, I'm using some more of those Crystal Mix gems. I used a larger one in the center of the snowflake and then a couple smaller ones around some of the outside. You can put as much or as little as you want. I only did some of the little round ones around the mirror silver one because I am running low on them. I didn't have enough to do it on all of the different layers, but it's enough to give it a little bit more texture and add that sparkle to it. So here is our second card. Very simple design. The ink blended and splattered background gives it a little bit more interest, but I love the different sizes for that snowflake. For my third card, I'm using that same Frozen Flurries background, and we are going to emboss our cardstock for our background. So I'm using the Stacking in my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine for embossing a die cut, and you can see we get some really fun texture with it. It almost looks like it's quilted. You can use either side of this piece of cardstock. I'm using the side that has a little bit more of a quilted look to it. And then I'm doing some ink blending with some Weathered Wood and Chipped Sapphire Distress ink. I'm using a large Spellbinders ink blending brush. This is really nice and soft, these brushes, and they're just a dream for ink blending. I'm putting the Weathered Wood all the way around my whole background here. And again, I'm not trying to get it nice and even blended. I'm leaving it fairly splotchy. I want it to have a more interesting look to it, not perfect. The focus of this card are going to be those playful penguins in my sentiment, not this background. This is just to enhance those snowflakes here. For the Chipped Sapphire, I'm just going around the edges and the top. The bottom part, I'm using one of my pieces of Astro paste with the glitter, the white one. And I'm just going to kind of create a snowy background with it. So my embossed piece here is once again cut down to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. I'm using a black mat on here. It's going to coordinate well with the penguins as well as my sentiment. That is cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4. We're doing this on an A2 card base. So before cutting my white Astro paste background to create that snow at the bottom, I cut it to 5 inches so it was the right width, and then just use some scissors to cut that snowy base. And if you wanted extra texture to it, you could do a couple layers of that snowy base, but I didn't think it was necessary. Once again, my focal point is those penguins. This is just a base for them to stand on. So I thought one layer was just enough. So I glued all those pieces to my background so that that could be drying while I was working on my penguins. I did all that die cutting off screen, and I'm just using the white parts of those penguins just to do a tiny little bit of ink blending to give them a little bit of dimension. That gray that I used there was some lost shadow just to give their tummies a little bit of dimension. And then I'm using some spun sugar for their cheeks. There is a die to do a die cut for their cheeks, but I figured because I was already wanting to ink blend that lost shadow there, that it would look cute if their cheeks were ink blended as well. Make them look a tiny little bit rosier. Now that I have that ink blending done, I can start assembling my little penguins. Off screen, when you die cut these black backgrounds for the penguins, it die cuts an open spot for their nose, and there's another die that you can die cut out of, and I did orange, the color you want their noses to be. If I was using a flat background, you can put that penguin on that background and just insert that nose there. But because my background is really textured, rather than making sure that I had it on an area where I could glue that nose properly, I just put a scrap of black cardstock behind it so then I could easily insert that little nose piece, and it just fits in there like a puzzle. It's really hard to see on screen because I have black cardstock behind black cardstock. And for those tiny pieces, I find using a jewel picker makes it really easy to pick up and place those tiny, tiny little die cuts. I don't need them for larger pieces, but for the really tiny pieces, they come in really handy. So the penguins are really, really easy to put together. First of all, you can follow the pictures on the front of the die package. And also when you die cut the black piece, it leaves a little indent showing you exactly where the white piece lays, so that it leaves very little wiggle room for trying to figure it out. There's also a die cut that cuts out all the feet for them, so those can be glued underneath them as well. For the accessories on these guys, this is where I used that cardstock that I had die cut from the Astro paste. So once it was completely dried, and I was sure that it was completely dried, I die cut it for the little accessories. I thought these would be cute rather than using regular cardstock, but you could easily use some regular cardstock, or if you don't have Astro paste, you could use just glitter cardstock. Again, I had ordered these from my local scrapbook store, and this was the perfect opportunity to use them, and I absolutely love the way they look. Because these are festive cards anyways, glitter cardstock or glitter just goes really well with it, and these tied these in really, really well. It just gave them some extra texture and dimension. Now there is a little wreath here that one of the guys can hold. I thought it'd be cute hanging off the little antlers, so I put a tiny bit of glue there and hung it off those antlers. Struggled a little bit to put it on to make it look like it was hanging naturally. And then there is a tiny, tiny little bow die that I also glued from that Astro Paste cardstock. I glued it down, or die cut it from the pink one. I'm going to put one of the little bows on the wreath, and then this other guy here, rather than having the present on the ground like the front of the package, I thought he would be cute holding the present, and I'm going to use the second bow on him. Now, when you die cut the little toque here, or beanie, I'm not sure what you guys call it in the States, we call it a toque here in Canada, it die cuts both the brim and the little pom-pom piece. So I die cut it out of the pink Astro Paste piece as well as the white. Now, I realized I didn't say this at the beginning. The Astro Paste that I'm using, the white one is Frostbite, the pink one is Prom Queen, the blue one is Clear Skies, and the turquoise one is called Tropical Tango. Or it's almost a greeny one, is Tropical Tango. And again, there are other colors as well. These are just the colors that I was most drawn to. So once those are glued, I do put my acrylic block on there and set them to the side. Because this Astro Paste is pretty much a non-porous surface, it's going to take a little bit longer for that glue to dry, and I'm still using that same Barely Art glue. I love it because it gives you some time to shimmy and wiggle things in place, but it starts to grip fairly fast. It's not going to grip quite as fast with these glitter pieces because they are non-porous. It still works, but you do need to give it just a tiny little bit of extra time. So for my sentiments, I die cut each one of them out of a different Astro paste background. So one of them is done with the Prom Queen, one of them is with the Clear Skies, and one of them is with the Tropical Tango. I chose just the colored ones instead of the white one. And then I'm using black shadows for this. I figured that would tie in really well with the black mat around our card as well as the black in the penguins. So with all of those pieces done and ready to go, I can start assembling my card. And when I lifted up the little one with the little antlers, the antlers didn't want to stay, so I had to glue those a second time, but that's okay. So I'm just I like to place everything that I want for the layout for my card just to make sure that the idea I have in my head is going to work. And I also like to do that for spacing. So by having everything on the card, I can make sure that I'm spacing everything properly. And I will typically start to glue the pieces in the center first and then start gluing the outer pieces. And that way, again, I can have the spacing correct. And then I will put my acrylic block on there and let them dry. By having all of these pieces completely glued together and ready to go, I only have to glue the assembled piece. It makes it a little bit easier that way. I find it easiest to do my assembly off my card and then just add the completed pieces to the card. So once my penguins were down, I can glue on my sentiments. Now I chose to use the 3 different colors just for fun. Partly because I had the pasted backgrounds done, partly because I couldn't decide which color I wanted to use, and also because I have a lot of those different colors on the accessories. It was just a fun little touch. I'm using a little bit of glossy accents for their eyes to make them shiny, and the center one has a little glittery nose. I'm putting some glossy accents on there as well. So I do need to let that completely dry. When you put them down, the glossy accents has a little bit of a hazy look, and when it's completely dry, it goes nice and clear. For the last detail on my little wreath here, I'm using some of the tiny gems from the Crystal Mix pack. I'm coming to the end of my pack and I basically just wanted to use them up. So I used that one. And then after the fact, I thought this berry one also would have looked really good and would have tied in really well with those glitter cardstock pieces. So that is another option as well. So here is the final penguin card. I absolutely love how playful those penguins are. I think they're just absolutely adorable. And then we have our layered snowflake card. I love that ink blended background with those metallic snowflakes. And then our snowflake background card. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here and all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.